"You're being watched. Don't eat the food." Those chilling words on a mysterious note would expose the most shocking restaurant conspiracy in federal history, proving that the quiet black veteran everyone dismissed was actually an undercover FBI agent, whose hidden badge would destroy lives built on hatred. When Marcus Johnson ordered an expensive steak and faced humiliation about affording it, nobody knew they were mocking a decorated Purple Heart recipient whose real mission would uncover systematic food poisoning used as a weapon against unwelcome customers. What happens when a waitress's desperate warning prevents attempted murder? And how does a federal raid expose a domestic terrorism network operating behind fine dining facades? Watch as criminal confessions reveal kitchen staff receiving hand signals to contaminate food, while secret recordings capture elite conspirators planning to eliminate minority businesses across Connecticut. This is the story of how one man's quiet courage transformed institutional cruelty into federal justice, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone assumes doesn't belong there.
He must be lost. Those 3 whispered words about a quiet black veteran would echo through an upscale steakhouse before a mysterious note and federal badge revealed that sometimes the most dangerous people in any room are the ones everyone assumes don't belong there. Marcus Johnson pushed through the heavy oak doors of the Wellington Steakhouse at exactly 7:30 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, his presence immediately disrupting the refined atmosphere of one of Connecticut's most exclusive dining establishments. The restaurant occupied a converted 19th-century mansion where crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in crisp white linen, and the soft murmur of conversations about stock portfolios and country club memberships provided the soundtrack to American upper-class dining. At 52, Marcus carried himself with the particular kind of quiet confidence that comes from surviving places where confidence meant the difference between life and death. His plain khaki slacks and navy polo shirt were clean and pressed, but unremarkable. The kind of outfit that marked him as clearly outside the demographic that typically frequented establishments where appetizers cost more than minimum wage workers earned in a day. His graying hair was cut with military precision, and his dark eyes held the alert stillness of someone who had learned to assess threats and opportunities with equal measure. The hostess, Ashley, a blonde 20-something whose perfectly manicured appearance suggested she had never worked anywhere that didn't cater to wealthy clientele, looked up from her reservation book with the kind of forced smile that service workers perfect when dealing with customers they'd rather not serve. Her eyes quickly scanned Marcus from head to toe, taking in his modest clothing and drawing conclusions that had nothing to do with his ability to pay and everything to do with assumptions about who belonged in spaces like the Wellington. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her voice carrying the particular tone that suggests the answer should be no, and that alternative establishments might be more suitable. Behind her, other staff members had begun to take notice of the interaction, their whispered conversations creating a background buzz of judgment and speculation. "He must be lost," came the whispered observation from somewhere behind the hostess station, followed by barely concealed snickers from staff members who had apparently concluded that this was either a case of mistaken identity or someone who had wandered into the wrong tax bracket by accident. Ashley's eye roll was subtle but unmistakable as she grabbed a single menu and gestured toward a table near the kitchen entrance, far from the prime window seating that offered views of the manicured gardens, and away from the tables where the Wellington's regular clientele conducted their business over $100 bottles of wine. But Marcus's quiet, "I'd prefer the table by the window,"
caused a moment of tension that rippled through the front-of-house staff like a stone dropped in still water. His request wasn't aggressive or demanding, but it carried the weight of someone who understood his right to equal treatment, regardless of how others perceived his appearance or economic status. The reluctant seating at Table 9 came with its own theater of passive-aggressive service, as Ashley made sure her displeasure was visible to both Marcus and the other staff members who were already forming opinions about the black man who had dared to request premium seating in their carefully curated environment. What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed as they whispered their judgments and rolled their eyes at his presence, was that Marcus Johnson wasn't just another customer who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. He was someone whose quiet demeanor masked a purpose that would soon expose every ugly assumption they had made and every cruel comment they had whispered about the man they had dismissed as lost. If you've ever been judged by your appearance before anyone bothered to learn who you really are, hit that like button right now. Share your own story of being underestimated in places where you had every right to be. And subscribe to this channel because what happens next will prove that the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming someone doesn't belong simply because they don't look like your typical customer.
Right at that moment, as Marcus settled into his window table overlooking the manicured gardens, the restaurant staff should have recognized that his calm confidence suggested someone accustomed to being exactly where he chose to be. But prejudice has a way of making people blind to obvious signs of strength, and what followed would prove that systematic cruelty often reveals more about the perpetrators than their targets. Claire approached Table 9 with the weary expression of someone who had been serving tables for 3 years while watching management treat certain customers like unwelcome intrusions. At 26, she had learned to navigate the toxic culture of the Wellington by keeping her head down and her opinions to herself. But something about the quiet dignity of the man at Table 9 made her usual routine feel particularly uncomfortable. She placed the basic dinner menu in front of Marcus without the usual flourish reserved for regular customers, deliberately skipping the leather-bound wine list and specialty menu that showcased the Wellington's most expensive offerings. The slight was calculated and obvious, designed to communicate that his presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Marcus studied the menu with the patient attention of someone who had learned to ignore subtle insults while gathering information, his eyes moving across the selections with genuine interest rather than the defensive posturing that most people displayed when facing obvious discrimination. When he looked up, his voice was steady and polite. "I'll have the dry-aged ribeye, medium rare, with the truffle mashed potatoes," he said, his selection representing the most expensive item on the menu at $68, not including sides or beverages. Claire's reaction was immediate and telling, her eyebrows rising in an expression that mixed surprise with barely concealed mockery. "You sure you can afford that?" she asked, her voice loud enough to carry to nearby tables where other diners had begun to take notice of the interaction. The question hung in the air like a challenge, transforming what should have been a routine order into a public test of Marcus's right to dine in an establishment that clearly viewed his presence as suspicious. But Marcus simply nodded, his composure intact even as the restaurant's atmosphere grew more hostile around him. The situation escalated when 2 regular customers at the adjacent table, emboldened by Claire's obvious disdain, began their own commentary on Marcus's presence. "Must be nice living off government handouts," one of them said, his voice deliberately loud as he gestured toward Marcus with his wineglass. "Veterans get everything handed to them these days while the rest of us work for a living." His companion's laughter was cruel and knowing, the sound of people who had never questioned their own privileges while assuming the worst about others' circumstances. "Probably using food stamps for a $60 steak," he added, his comment drawing snickers from other nearby tables. Greg, the restaurant manager, materialized beside Claire's station with the predatory attention of someone who had been monitoring the situation from across the dining room. His whispered conversation with Claire was brief but pointed, his body language making it clear that Marcus's continued presence was viewed as a problem requiring management intervention. "We don't need his kind here scaring off the regulars," Greg muttered, his words carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had never been forced to examine his own biases. Claire nodded, but something in her expression had shifted as she watched Marcus maintain his dignity in the face of systematic humiliation. As she walked toward the kitchen to place his order, she pulled out her order pad and began writing something that wasn't related to food preparation, her movements quick and deliberate as she crafted a message that would change everything.
No one expected what happened when Claire returned with Marcus's order, because sometimes acts of unexpected courage come from the most unlikely sources, and what she was about to do would transform a routine dinner into a moment that exposed the dangerous truth about institutional hatred disguised as fine dining. 28 minutes later, Claire approached table 9 carrying a plate that should have represented the culmination of the Wellington's culinary expertise, a perfectly seared, dry-aged ribeye accompanied by truffle mashed potatoes that justify the restaurant's reputation among Connecticut's elite. But something in her expression had changed since taking Marcus's order. Her usual detached professionalism replaced by a nervous energy that suggested internal conflict between duty and conscience. Marcus looked up from his phone as she approached, his demeanor unchanged, despite the sustained hostility he had endured since entering the restaurant. He had spent the intervening time observing the dining room with the analytical patience of someone accustomed to gathering intelligence in hostile environments, noting the staff's whispered conversations and the regular customers' pointed stares without allowing any of it to disturb his quiet composure. "Here's your ribeye, sir," Claire said, her voice carefully neutral as she placed the plate in front of him with movements that seemed more deliberate than necessary. But as she set down the plate, her other hand moved with practiced stealth, sliding a small folded piece of paper under the edge of the dinner plate with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't her first experience with covert communication. Marcus's trained eyes immediately noticed the paper's placement, but he made no move to retrieve it while Claire remained at the table. Only after she had walked away, ostensibly returning to her other duties, did he casually unfold the note while appearing to arrange his napkin and silverware. The message, written in Claire's hurried handwriting, was brief but devastating. "You're being watched. Don't eat the food. Ask for a to-go box and leave. C." The words hit Marcus like ice water, confirming suspicions that had been building since his arrival at the Wellington. His hand, which had been reaching for his steak knife, froze in mid-motion as the implications of Claire's warning crystallized in his mind. This wasn't just about poor service or casual racism. This was about something far more sinister and potentially dangerous. His military training kicked in immediately, transforming his casual dining posture into a state of heightened awareness disguised as continued normalcy. His eyes swept the dining room with renewed purpose, cataloging exits, noting staff positions, and assessing potential threats while maintaining the appearance of a customer simply enjoying his meal. But he didn't touch the food. The perfectly cooked steak, which had cost more than many people's daily wages, remained untouched as Marcus processed the reality that someone in the Wellington's kitchen had potentially tampered with his order in ways that went beyond poor service or deliberate delays. "Excuse me," Marcus called to Claire, his voice carrying just enough volume to seem normal while ensuring she would hear his request. "Could I get a to-go box, please? Something came up and I need to leave." Claire's relief was visible but carefully controlled as she nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen. Marcus remained perfectly still, his untouched steak cooling on the plate while he prepared for whatever came next, understanding that Claire's warning had just confirmed that the Wellington wasn't just guilty of discrimination, it was guilty of something far worse. The quiet veteran who had been dismissed as lost was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones everyone underestimates.
Right at that moment, as Marcus walked out of the Wellington with his untouched steak in a to-go container, the restaurant staff thought they had successfully intimidated another unwelcome customer into leaving quietly. But what they didn't know was that they had just provided crucial evidence to someone whose real purpose would soon transform their world of casual cruelty into a federal criminal investigation. Marcus's pickup truck sat in the far corner of the Wellington's parking lot, deliberately positioned to provide optimal surveillance angles while maintaining the appearance of a casual customer's vehicle. The dented Ford F-150, with its faded paint and veteran license plates, perfectly matched the persona he had cultivated, a working-class black man who might struggle to afford an expensive meal but deserved the same treatment as any other paying customer. But as he opened the truck's cab and reached behind the driver's seat, Marcus revealed the first hint of his true identity. The small black case he retrieved looked innocuous enough, resembling the kind of toolkit that contractors or technicians might carry for routine equipment maintenance. However, the sophisticated recording equipment inside represented cutting-edge federal surveillance technology that had been documenting every conversation, every insult, and every moment of discrimination he had endured since entering the restaurant. Marcus Johnson wasn't just a veteran trying to enjoy a quiet dinner. He was Special Agent Marcus Johnson, a 15-year veteran of the FBI Civil Rights Division who had been specifically assigned to investigate a pattern of complaints about the Wellington that had been building for over 8 months. The Department of Justice had received multiple reports alleging systematic discrimination against black customers, but previous investigations had been stymied by the restaurant's careful legal maneuvering and the reluctance of victims to pursue formal complaints against a well-connected establishment. The recording equipment hidden in his clothing had captured everything. Claire's insulting question about his ability to pay, the customer's comments about government handouts, Greg's whispered instructions about not wanting his kind in the restaurant, and most importantly, Claire's warning about the food being tampered with. Each recorded conversation represented potential federal charges ranging from civil rights violations to criminal food tampering with intent to harm. As he carefully removed the nearly invisible recording devices from his shirt collar and jacket lapel, Marcus reflected on the sophistication of the operation he had just exposed. The Wellington wasn't just guilty of casual racism or poor customer service. They were potentially running a criminal enterprise that used food contamination as a weapon against customers they deemed undesirable. The untouched steak in the to-go container would be submitted for laboratory analysis within hours, tested for everything from common food adulterants to potentially lethal substances that could cause serious illness or death. Claire's warning had potentially saved his life while providing the evidence needed to bring federal charges against everyone involved in the conspiracy. But this case was more than just another civil rights investigation for Marcus. The assignment had been personal from the moment he accepted it, driven by experiences that had shaped his understanding of how discrimination could escalate from social humiliation to genuine physical danger. His own transition from military service to civilian life had been marked by encounters with people who saw his uniform as a costume rather than evidence of service, who questioned his intelligence, his patriotism, and his right to equal treatment in the country he had sworn to protect. The parallels between his own experiences and the complaints about the Wellington were unmistakable. Black customers being seated in inferior locations, questioned about their ability to pay, subjected to deliberate delays and poor service, and in several documented cases, becoming seriously ill after eating food that had apparently been tampered with by kitchen staff who viewed discrimination as entertainment.
Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from his FBI task force coordinator. Status report. The response he typed would set in motion a federal investigation that would involve multiple agencies, grand jury proceedings, and criminal charges that could result in decades of prison time for the conspirators. Evidence confirmed, food tampering suspected, Request immediate lab analysis and arrest warrants for multiple subjects. Full recording available for review. Recommend coordinated raid within 24 hours. As he started his truck and pulled out of the Wellington's parking lot, Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at the thought of tomorrow morning's surprise for Greg, the kitchen staff, and everyone else who had participated in what they thought was harmless harassment, but was actually a federal conspiracy to violate civil rights through criminal food contamination. The quiet veteran they had dismissed as lost was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one with a federal badge who everyone assumes doesn't belong there. The Wellington staff thought they had successfully intimidated another unwelcome customer, but they had actually just provided evidence for their own federal prosecution. Claire's courage in warning him had not only potentially saved his life, but had transformed her from unwilling participant to key witness in a case that would expose the ugly truth about institutional racism disguised as fine dining. If you believe that everyone deserves equal treatment regardless of their appearance or background, if you've ever witnessed discrimination disguise itself as customer service, hit that like button right now. Share your thoughts on how we can build restaurants and businesses that serve everyone with dignity. And subscribe to this channel because what happens next will prove that justice sometimes wears a badge that no one sees coming.
But the tragedy had not stopped yet, because sometimes the most powerful motivations for justice come from personal pain that has been transformed into professional purpose. And what Marcus had endured long before entering the Wellington would explain why this case meant more to him than just another federal investigation. The drive back to his hotel gave Marcus time to process not just the evening's evidence gathering, but the memories that this assignment had dredged up from the depths of his carefully compartmentalized past. The transition from Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson to Special Agent Marcus Johnson hadn't been the smooth progression that recruitment brochures suggested. It had been a journey through a landscape of discrimination that made tonight's restaurant humiliation feel like a gentle introduction to American civilian racism. The flashback hit him as he sat in his hotel room, staring at the recording equipment that had captured the Wellington's casual cruelty. Suddenly, he was 28 again, fresh from his second deployment in Afghanistan, sitting across from a hiring manager who had seemed impressed by his resume until Marcus walked through the door and shattered whatever assumptions had been made based on his name and military credentials. "Well," the manager had said, his enthusiasm visibly deflating as he took in Marcus's appearance, "you're certainly not what we expected. Are you sure you're qualified for this management position? It requires a lot of responsibility and, frankly, most of you people are better suited for more physical roles." The Purple Heart in Marcus's dress uniform pocket had seemed meaningless in that sterile conference room, where his Bronze Star for valor and his commendations for leadership under fire were dismissed as easily as his college degree and technical certifications. The manager's final comment had burned itself into Marcus's memory with the precision of a branding iron. "You might try construction or security work, something more appropriate for someone with your background." But the most devastating blow hadn't come from strangers who questioned his qualifications or employers who doubted his intelligence. It had come 3 years later when his younger brother David had been killed during a routine traffic stop that escalated into a tragedy that destroyed Marcus's faith in the system he had spent his military career defending. David Johnson had been a pharmacy student at Howard University, 2 months away from graduation, when a routine drive home for Christmas had been interrupted by police officers who saw a young black man in a nice car and assumed criminal activity. The dashcam footage that emerged months later showed David's hands clearly visible on the steering wheel, his voice calm and respectful as he explained that he was a student heading home for the holidays. But Officer Williams had seen something different. a threat that existed only in his imagination, a danger that justified the use of lethal force against an unarmed student whose only crime had been driving while black in a neighborhood that his presence was deemed suspicious. The investigation that followed had been a masterclass in institutional cover-up, with David's character assassinated posthumously, while Officer Williams received a brief suspension before returning to duty. That was when Marcus had changed careers, trading his plans for civilian corporate success for a federal badge and the power to investigate the kind of systematic discrimination that had killed his brother and wounded his own soul. Every civil rights case since then had carried David's memory. Every investigation had been an opportunity to prevent another family from experiencing the devastating loss that had redefined Marcus's understanding of justice in America.
The complaints about the Wellington had triggered something deeper than professional obligation when Marcus first read them in his FBI field office. 3 black customers had been hospitalized after eating at the restaurant over a 6-month period, each suffering from severe food poisoning that required emergency medical treatment. The symptoms had been consistent with deliberate food contamination, but local health inspectors had found no violations, and the restaurant's management had blamed the illnesses on pre-existing conditions or food consumed elsewhere. But Marcus had recognized the pattern, the same systematic dehumanization that had led to David's death, the same institutional blindness that allowed discrimination to escalate from social humiliation to physical harm. The Wellington staff thought they were just having fun at the expense of unwelcome customers, but they were actually participating in a form of domestic terrorism that used food as a weapon against people whose only crime was expecting equal treatment. The most chilling aspect of the case was how ordinary the perpetrators appeared to be. Claire, Greg, and the kitchen staff weren't obvious extremists or violent criminals, but regular people who had been conditioned to view certain customers as less than human. Their casual cruelty reflected a deeper sickness in American society that allowed discrimination to flourish in environments where it was normalized, encouraged, and protected by institutional indifference. As Marcus prepared his preliminary report for the DOJ task force, he understood that the Wellington case represented more than just another restaurant practicing illegal discrimination. It was a microcosm of the systemic racism that had shaped his brother's death, his own civilian struggles, and the experiences of countless Americans who had learned that equality was a promise that didn't extend to every citizen. Tomorrow's federal raid would deliver justice for David, for the 3 hospitalized victims, and for every black customer who had been made to feel unwelcome in a country that claimed to value equal treatment under law. Right at that moment, as Marcus finalized his federal report that would destroy the Wellington's carefully constructed facade, a figure emerged from the restaurant's back alley who would transform the entire scope of the investigation. What Claire revealed during their clandestine meeting would prove that the discrimination Marcus had documented was just the surface of a criminal conspiracy that reached deeper into Connecticut's elite community than anyone had imagined. The text message had arrived at Marcus's hotel room at 11:47 p.m., sent from an unknown number with a message that made his blood run cold. Parking lot behind Dunkin' Donuts on Route 7. Come alone. You need to know what you're really dealing with. C. Claire's decision to reach out represented a courage that Marcus had rarely encountered in 15 years of federal investigations. Most witnesses waited to be contacted by authorities, reluctant to involve themselves in cases that could threaten their employment or personal safety. But Claire had taken the initiative to provide information that could expose her to retaliation from people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use food as a weapon against unwelcome customers. When Marcus pulled his truck into the dimly lit parking lot behind the donut shop, Claire was already waiting in her Honda Civic, her nervous energy visible even through the tinted windows. The moment she slipped into his passenger seat, Her first words revealed the depth of her connection to the Wellingtons' criminal activities. "I'm not just a waitress," she said, her voice shaking with a combination of fear and determination that suggested someone who had been carrying a terrible secret for months. "I'm Greg's niece. My uncle owns half the restaurant, and I've been documenting everything because I knew someone would eventually get seriously hurt or killed." The revelation transformed everything Marcus thought he understood about tonight's events. Claire wasn't just a sympathetic employee who had witnessed discrimination. She was an insider with access to information that could expose the full scope of the Wellingtons' criminal conspiracy. Her warning about the food tampering wasn't based on suspicion or rumors, but on direct knowledge of systematic practices that put customers' lives at risk. "The kitchen staff has a code system," Claire continued, pulling out her phone to show Marcus photos and videos she had secretly recorded over the past 8 months. "When certain customers are seated, Black customers, Hispanic customers, anyone they think doesn't belong, Greg signals the kitchen with hand gestures. Tonight he held up 2 fingers, which means make them sick." The evidence on Claire's phone was damning beyond anything Marcus had hoped to uncover during a single evening's investigation. Video clips showed kitchen staff deliberately contaminating food with cleaning chemicals, expired ingredients, and substances that could cause severe gastrointestinal distress. The conspiracy wasn't just about discrimination. It was about using food poisoning as a weapon to ensure that unwelcome customers would never return. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. "There's something else you need to know," Claire said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she glanced around the empty parking lot. "The Wellington isn't just a restaurant. 3 times a month, after hours, my uncle hosts private gatherings for what he calls the VIP Dining Club. It's really a racist organization that meets to plan harassment campaigns against minority-owned businesses in the area."
The scope of the criminal conspiracy was staggering. The Wellington wasn't just practicing illegal discrimination against individual customers, it was serving as headquarters for a coordinated effort to drive minority entrepreneurs out of Connecticut's affluent communities through systematic harassment, false health department complaints, and economic sabotage disguised as business competition. Claire's documentation included recordings of these private meetings, photographs of attendees, who included local politicians and business leaders, and detailed notes about planned campaigns against Black-owned restaurants, Hispanic-owned retail stores, and Asian-owned service businesses throughout the region. The Wellingtons' discrimination against individual customers was connected to a much larger conspiracy that threatened the economic survival of minority communities across Connecticut. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked, recognizing that Claire's cooperation could expose her to serious danger from people who had already demonstrated their willingness to harm others for racial reasons. "Because 3 people have been hospitalized, and I think my uncle is planning something worse," she replied, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "Last week I heard him talking about permanent solutions for customers who keep coming back despite being warned away. I think he's planning to seriously injure or kill someone." The implication was chilling. The Wellingtons' food tampering had escalated from causing temporary illness to potentially causing permanent harm or death. Claire's warning meant that Marcus's investigation had prevented not just a case of food poisoning, but possibly a murder disguised as an unfortunate dining experience. "I have files, recordings, photographs, everything you need to shut them down," Claire continued, her determination overcoming her fear as she realized that her cooperation could prevent tragedies that had been months in the planning. "But I need protection. These people have connections throughout local law enforcement, and they'll destroy me if they discover I've been gathering evidence." Marcus understood that Claire's courage had just transformed a civil rights investigation into a potential domestic terrorism case that would require federal protection for witnesses and coordinated raids across multiple locations.
The quiet waitress who had slipped him a warning note had actually been conducting her own undercover investigation, documenting crimes that could result in decades of federal prison time for everyone involved.
No one expected what happened at dawn the next morning, because sometimes federal justice arrives with the precision of military operations and the overwhelming force that transforms criminal conspiracies into federal prosecutions that reshape entire communities. What unfolded at the Wellington would prove that some battles against institutional racism require more than individual courage. They require the full power of federal law enforcement. At exactly 6:30 a.m., as the Wellington's kitchen staff arrived for their morning prep shift, they found themselves face to face with a coordinated federal operation that had been planned throughout the night based on Claire's evidence and Marcus's recordings. 12 FBI agents, 4 Department of Justice civil rights investigators, 2 health department inspectors, and a federal prosecutor converged on the restaurant with search warrants that covered every aspect of the criminal conspiracy Claire had documented. The timing was deliberate and devastating. Greg arrived at his usual 6:45 a.m. to find federal agents already inside the restaurant, systematically photographing evidence, seizing computer hard drives, and documenting the kitchen's contamination protocols that had been used to poison unwelcome customers. His shocked expression transformed into panic as he realized that someone had provided law enforcement with detailed information about operations he thought were completely secret. "Federal agents, nobody move," came the authoritative command that shattered the morning quiet of Connecticut's most exclusive dining establishment. The kitchen staff, who had been joking about the previous night's special treatment of the black customer, suddenly found themselves handcuffed and read their Miranda rights as federal evidence collection teams documented every surface, every container, and every possible source of the contamination that had hospitalized 3 people over the past 8 months. The head chef, Robert Manning, broke within 20 minutes of questioning. Faced with federal charges that could result in life imprisonment if someone died from the food tampering, he provided a detailed confession that implicated not just the kitchen staff, but the systematic nature of the discrimination that had been institutionalized at the Wellington since its opening 5 years earlier. "We got signals from management," Manning confessed, his voice shaking as he realized the magnitude of the federal charges he was facing. "Hand signals that told us which customers to treat differently. Greg would hold up fingers. 1 finger meant slow service, 2 fingers meant contaminate the food enough to make them sick, 3 fingers meant—" He paused, unable to complete the sentence that would have described attempted murder. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the restaurant's own security cameras, which had been recording every discriminatory interaction, every contamination incident, and every moment of systematic cruelty that the staff had assumed would never be scrutinized by law enforcement. The digital evidence painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years, protected by the assumption that their victims wouldn't have the resources or connections to demand federal investigation. Greg's arrest was captured by local news crews who had been tipped off about the federal raid, creating footage that would be broadcast across Connecticut and eventually go viral on social media platforms as viewers witnessed the destruction of a racist conspiracy that had masqueraded as fine dining. His perp walk from the Wellington to the federal transport vehicle became symbolic of the justice that had been denied to previous victims who had been dismissed, ignored, or intimidated into silence. The most satisfying moment came when federal agents executed search warrants at Greg's home, where they discovered detailed files documenting the VIP dining club meetings that Claire had described. The evidence included membership lists of local politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials who had participated in coordinated harassment campaigns against minority-owned businesses throughout the region.
The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The Wellington had served as headquarters for a domestic terrorism organization that used economic sabotage, false regulatory complaints, and systematic harassment to drive minority entrepreneurs out of affluent Connecticut communities. The restaurant's discrimination against individual customers had been connected to a much larger criminal enterprise that threatened the economic survival of entire communities. But the most emotionally powerful moment of the raid came when Claire emerged from the federal witness protection vehicle where she had been safely housed during the operation. Her courage in documenting the conspiracy and providing evidence to federal investigators had not only exposed the criminal organization, but had potentially saved lives by preventing the escalation to more serious violence that Greg had been planning. Marcus watched from his truck as Claire was escorted to a secure location where she would be debriefed by federal prosecutors preparing for what would become one of the largest civil rights prosecutions in Connecticut's history. Her transformation from reluctant witness to key cooperator had been crucial to exposing a conspiracy that extended far beyond the Wellington's dining room into the highest levels of local government and business leadership. The laboratory analysis of Marcus's untouched steak confirmed the presence of industrial cleaning chemicals that could have caused severe internal damage or death if consumed. The evidence proved that Claire's warning had quite literally saved his life while providing the final piece of evidence needed to upgrade charges from civil rights violations to attempted murder. Within hours, federal grand jury proceedings had begun, targeting not just the Wellington staff, but the entire network of conspirators who had used the restaurant as a base of operations for systematic terrorism against minority communities. The charges ranged from civil rights violations to attempted murder, racketeering, and domestic terrorism, federal crimes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years. As Marcus filed his final report with the Department of Justice, he understood that the Wellington case represented more than just another successful civil rights investigation. It had exposed a sophisticated domestic terrorism network that had operated with impunity for years, protected by the assumption that their victims wouldn't have the resources or federal connections necessary to demand justice. The quiet veteran who had been dismissed as lost had just dismantled a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Connecticut's power structure, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one with a federal badge who everyone assumes doesn't belong there.
Right at that moment, as federal prosecutors prepared for trials that would reshape Connecticut's understanding of institutional racism, Marcus Johnson was already envisioning something far more powerful than criminal convictions. What emerged 18 months later would prove that the greatest victories against discrimination come not from destroying enemies, but from building something so beautiful and inclusive that it transforms entire communities forever. The Wellington closed permanently within 72 hours of the federal raid, its liquor license revoked, its health permits suspended, and its reputation destroyed by wall-to-wall news coverage of the domestic terrorism conspiracy that had operated behind its elegant facade. Greg received a 23-year federal sentence for civil rights violations, attempted murder, and racketeering, while the kitchen staff members who had participated in the food contamination conspiracy faced sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years in federal prison. But the most profound transformation belonged to Claire, whose courage in exposing the conspiracy had earned her federal witness protection, a full scholarship to complete her interrupted nursing degree, and eventually a position as Director of Community Outreach for what would become Connecticut's most celebrated example of restorative justice through entrepreneurship. The space that had once housed the Wellington's dining room, where Marcus had endured systematic humiliation while gathering evidence of criminal conspiracy, now buzzed with the warm energy of Sargent's Table, a veteran-owned restaurant that had become a beacon of inclusion in a community that had once practiced exclusion as entertainment.
The transformation was both symbolic and practical. The same kitchen that had been used to poison unwelcome customers now produced meals that brought together people from every background, economic level, and ethnicity in Connecticut's increasingly diverse community. Marcus had used his federal settlement, combined with his military pension, and a substantial loan from the Small Business Administration's Veteran Entrepreneur Program to create something that honored both his brother's memory and his own commitment to building rather than just investigating. The restaurant's mission statement, displayed prominently near the entrance, captured everything he had learned about dignity, service, and the power of treating every human being with respect. Good food, honest service, and genuine welcome for everyone who enters our doors. The grand opening had drawn hundreds of people, including many of the federal investigators who had worked on the Wellington case, local civil rights leaders who had supported Marcus's vision, and dozens of veterans who finally had a place where their service was honored rather than questioned. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when the first black customer after the official opening, a young veteran named James, who bore a striking resemblance to Marcus's late brother David, was seated at the best table in the house and served with the kind of respect that should be standard everywhere, but was still remarkable enough to draw tears from observers who understood the significance. Claire's role as Director of Community Outreach had evolved into something far more important than a job title. She had become the bridge between Sargent's table and the broader community healing that was necessary after the exposure of the Wellington conspiracy. Her programs included free meals for struggling families, job training for formerly incarcerated individuals seeking second chances, and educational workshops about recognizing and confronting discrimination in all its forms.
The restaurant's success had exceeded every projection, drawing customers from across New England who came not just for the excellent food, but for the opportunity to dine in a place that represented the kind of America that veterans like Marcus had fought to defend. The walls displayed photos of service members from every branch of the military, every conflict, and every background, creating a visual reminder that heroism comes in every color and speaks with every accent. But the most powerful testament to the restaurant's impact came through the stories of transformation it had fostered. Local business owners who had once participated in the discrimination that the Wellington had represented now actively supported minority entrepreneurs, understanding that economic inclusion strengthened rather than threatened their own success. High school students worked part-time at Sargent's table while learning lessons about dignity, respect, and the kind of leadership that builds communities rather than dividing them. The final scene that captured everything Marcus had accomplished unfolded on a busy Saturday evening, exactly 2 years after his fateful dinner at the Wellington. A young black veteran, recently returned from deployment overseas, entered Sargent's table with the nervous energy of someone who had experienced discrimination in restaurants before and wasn't sure what to expect. Marcus approached the veteran's table personally, wearing the simple polo shirt and khakis that had once marked him as suspicious in the Wellington's dining room, but now identified him as the owner of Connecticut's most successful veteran-owned business. The conversation was brief but profound, two men who understood the weight of service and sacrifice, sharing a moment of recognition that transcended words. "Welcome home, soldier," Marcus said simply, placing a perfectly cooked steak dinner on the table without being asked for an order. "This one's on the house. Thank you for your service." The young veteran's eyes filled with tears as he realized he was experiencing something that should be normal but felt miraculous. Genuine respect, authentic welcome, and the kind of dignity that Marcus had fought to ensure would be available to everyone who walked through those doors. As Marcus returned to the kitchen, he paused to look at the framed photograph of his brother David that hung near the service window, accompanied by the simple inscription, "In memory of those who served their country and deserved better from their countrymen." The text that appeared on screen as the camera pulled back to show the bustling restaurant filled with people of every background sharing meals and conversations captured the essence of everything Marcus had built from the ashes of institutional hatred. Respect is earned,
but dignity should never be denied. The quiet veteran who had been dismissed as lost had found his way home, and in doing so had created a home for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong.
Here's the truth that Marcus Johnson taught us without ever raising his voice. In a world where people judge worthiness by appearance rather than character, the most dangerous mistake you can make is underestimating someone whose quiet strength has been forged in places where weakness means death. Marcus's story reveals something profound about how justice works when institutional systems fail. The Wellington staff made the classic error of confusing silence with weakness, assuming that someone who endured their cruelty with dignity was someone who could be safely dismissed. But Marcus understood something they never learned, that real power often moves quietly, that federal badges don't announce themselves, and that sometimes the most effective response to discrimination is gathering evidence while planning systematic justice. What makes his victory so powerful is that he didn't just expose a criminal conspiracy. He used his experience to create something that honored both his brother's memory and his commitment to building rather than just investigating. Sargent's Table isn't just a restaurant, it's proof that the best response to institutional hatred is authentic inclusion, that dignity is contagious when it's genuine, and that communities heal when leaders choose to lift others up. The Wellington conspiracy reminds us that discrimination rarely stays at the level of poor service. When prejudice is allowed to flourish unchecked, it escalates into criminal behavior that threatens lives. Greg's hand signals weren't just harassment, they were domestic terrorism disguised as hospitality, proving that systematic dehumanization inevitably leads to actual violence. Claire's courage in documenting crimes and testifying against family members proves that moral authority doesn't require official titles. It just requires the conviction to choose right over comfortable, truth over convenient. But perhaps the most important lesson is that transformation is always possible. The same community that harbored criminal conspiracy embraced inclusion, proving that people are capable of growth when given leadership that models excellence rather than exclusion. Marcus didn't just serve justice, he served hope. If this story reminded you that heroes often come disguised as ordinary people, if it inspired you to treat everyone with respect, hit that like button right now. Share your experiences with being underestimated or witnessing quiet strength. I read every comment, and your stories inspire the content I create. Subscribe for more stories that prove character is more powerful than circumstances, and that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone assumes doesn't belong there.